Yeah, what you're talking about is creating a legal narrative. Legal narratives have been imposed upon us by the Supreme Court, by Congress, by state governments, even county commissioners are imposing legal narratives on us up in Sisseton by permitting groundwater that isn't theirs. United States versus Montana is a Supreme Court case that attorneys learn. It says that we don't have jurisdiction over non-Indians on fee land within reservation boundaries. But the key here is when you look at these, what we call implied divestiture treaty rights, which are violations of international and federal law. It's Supreme Court separation of powers violation of their own rule. They're making law. To condense these cases, basically it doesn't say anything about the land. It just says we don't have criminal or civil jurisdiction over non-Indians. When you look at the rules in that context, whether it's a highway, fee land, trust land, if we can begin to create our legal narratives of jurisdiction under the 1851 Treaty of collective jurisdiction or collective ownership of the natural resources through codification at the tribal level, then what you have now is you're not claiming jurisdiction over the non-Indian. You're claiming jurisdiction over the burials along the riverbed or on the fee land, the sacred site, the cultural resources, the subsurface minerals, the water, the natural resources, the airspace. And if we can look at that in all those different jurisdictions that exist on that land, we may be able to get our attorneys to do some real research and start empowering us and telling us what we can do instead of what we can't. And so you're already there. It's about creating our own legal narrative so that we can define our exclusive jurisdictions as the rule of law has preserved under these treaties. Did that answer your question? There's a copyright infringement case that was filed by Navajo Nation by a colleague of mine, Brian Lewis, who sued Navajo Outfitters, who was this billion-dollar corporation that was selling climbing gear and recreational outdoor equipment using the Navajo name. And the rule of copyright law is if it creates confusion, then it's got to go. And that's kind of been the trend in all these jurisdictions. So that clearly people were buying this gear thinking they were buying it from Navajo people. So those are the kinds of strategies that our tribal councils haven't looked into because there's not a whole lot of precedent out there. What happened in that case, it didn't go to court. The corporation settled and decided not to use the name anymore. But if we had that kind of strategizing going on in our tribal governance, and maybe that's a trend of the future here as we see Yankton Sioux take the lead on beginning to codify some of these inherent rights. And really what you're doing is when you're codifying your treaty rights, which has really never been done before, you're not allowing another sovereign to impose their legal narrative on you. You're exercising your rights by expressing them first. You can't exercise your rights if you don't express them. You see these no trespassing, no hunting signs on people's private property. Well, we all know we can't go on their property as U.S. citizens on another U.S. citizen's fee land, and there might be some exceptions to that in the future, but that's notice. And so what we're doing by expressing our narrative is putting people on notice that this is the rule of law. And you can't enforce your rights until you're able to exercise them. So it's one step and then the next, and that's what Yankton Sioux's taking the lead on.
I think a good example of that is consultation, because they put up the no trespassing sign, and our issue with treaty is consent. So when we enter into consultation, we've already taken their narrative. And so from our position, what we do is we've developed what we call WOPE protocols, and so they can't talk to just our TIPO, they can't talk to our elected officials. If they want to get consent from us, they have to go to our general counsel, and none of them are willing to do that at this point. Only the Pipestone Monument people have come. They're the only ones that have honored our protocols, so they're in violation of our own, so that's why we're building this narrative. So at some point, but to go into court right now, we're not ready. We need to have this all in place. So we're pretty excited about that. But like we said, we're living by their rules. So we really have to kind of shake your spirit and say, whose rule and what capacity am I living in? Because when you're at Standing Rock and saying, I'm exercising my treaty right, there's nothing that is solid behind that yet. And that's what we're trying to build. Okay? It makes us more vulnerable if we don't realize that. And also up there, when they said freedom of speech, that was as a citizen. It wasn't as a treaty beneficiary. That came from the US Constitution. So you have to realize what capacity am I acting in when I'm talking today. Okay? Any other questions?
Oh, I'm sorry I shocked you with my camera. But this is maybe a silly question, but you're saying that we still maintain under the treaty, the mineral rights in the riverbed. So does that mean the oil flowing through the pipeline going in through the riverbed, that we may have some rights to it and say on it?
Absolutely. You know, until we understand these, I mean, we haven't even done a territorial inventory of our assets as tribal governments. Who doesn't get accountability of their assets on their property? So, I mean, yes, absolutely. And so once I think we understand this concept of collective ownership that's retained by the 1851 treaty, then that's a pretty easy concept to understand.
Yeah, it's really good that you asked that, because we can't just go out and write these things. We have to do an inventory. Because at this point, we can't stand here and say, I own this, I own that. We have to compile it in an inventory, and so we're doing an inherent rights inventory now. That's the first step.
Any other questions?
You got two more.
You said something about the mineral rights were not given up with the treaty, but what about all the permits being given out in the gold, etc.?
The permits are being given out illegally because the jurisdiction is the 7 Council Fire families. The state, you know, you even see the federal agencies given state jurisdiction in these places and doing the state interest balancing test. The rule of law is simple. Article 6 of the Constitution says treaties are supreme law of the land, supreme over U.S. park regulation and rules, supreme over secretary regs, supreme over congressional acts. It's the supreme law of the land. It's textual analysis, straightforward. Now, are we under those treaties? No, just the U.S. officials that are to comply with those treaties. So when they're not in compliance with an express duty, they're not acting as a government official. They're acting in their individual capacity, opening themselves up to be sued for all their possessions.
But in order to reach that, we have to do our homework. That's what we're doing. We're laying all of that out before we can jump up there and say, this is illegal, I'm going to stop you. We're not ready. We have to build our narrative. That makes sense? Yeah.
Sir, do you have a resource like a book or something that I could read to start getting more under something I can go back and reread until I get it?
We're working on that. Maybe we can get some publications out, but right now the time is so urgent. There's really no time to make it an academic. We have to move forward with those tribal leaders that are willing to move forward right now.
Thank you.
And there's also strategy. There's things that we can't disclose as we move forward.
Please, a hand.